Thus far, we've been talking about ethical decision-making as something that you can do kind of irrespective of the pressures that are on you, and that you'll always follow what your natural intuition is. While we haven't discussed some key models or ways you might think about it, we've had this idea that it's a cognitive process. You remember earlier, I think it was in video 2, where we discussed the impact of other factors on that decision process, things like the context that you're in. So one of the major things that will disrupt ethical decision-making are biases, right? This plays into Haidt's idea of unconscious decision-making that occurs, or intuitive decision-making, as he would say. It also shows some of the social context and pressures from that generalised Schwartz model from video 2. So what we want to deal with are these pressures on us, and because we're doing business ethics, we're going to look at pressures that will be on us, particularly in a business context. This week, we're going to look at individual level biases. That is, biases that come upon us not so much from an external group pressure, but how individuals think about decisions when they need to make them. Now, these are generalised biases, but they're particularly applicable in a business setting. And so we'll go through each of them and think about how they might affect your decision-making around ethical issues. Now, while there's many biases that can affect your decision-making, we're going to deal with 4, right? The first one is confirmation bias, which is where you look for evidence that confirm your beliefs. So you dismiss evidence that challenges them. We all know that can, if you don't weigh the evidence properly, you can come to the wrong decision. A second key bias that can occur is in-group bias. Now, when we're talking about in-group bias here, we're talking about how the person thinks, right? People categorise others as either in their group or outside their group. And we all tend to favour people within our group, however we classify that group. That can definitely affect our decision-making. Third, we can bias our decision based upon judging the outcome, not whether the decision was taken with any moral integrity. So a gamble that is profitable might be considered good even if it's morally dubious. That's an outcome bias. And fourth is a series of issues involved in moral disengagement. That's where you, as the decision maker, tend to disconnect your decision or action from the standard. You say it's someone else's fault. Like, when do you morally disengage from the problem before you? So let's look at all those a little more deeply. So as we've got here, confirmation occurs where you will tend to seek out and more readily believe information that supports your existing belief. At the same time, you downplay, ignore or dismiss evidence that could disprove or challenge those beliefs. This kind of confirmation bias has been made a lot worse by things like social media feeds and algorithms that feed you confirming information and downplay information that could disprove. So it's becoming harder and harder as an individual to deal with this particular bias. How might this play out in a business setting? Well, imagine you're on a committee and you've got to investigate unethical behaviour. Now, if you believe that successful units are inherently well managed and ethical, then you might seek and trust information that aligns with that belief. For instance, you could overly rely on the assurance of senior managers who are doing well and downplay the importance of whistleblowers, etc. So what you're doing is selectively trusting and dismissing contrary evidence based upon what you want to believe without even knowing it. A different kind of bias is in-group bias, which is the tendency for you, as well, individuals, so for you, to favour members of your own group over those other groups or the out-groups. That means you positively evaluate their, for instance, behaviours. You can see exactly the same behaviour, right? If someone's silent in a meeting, is it because that they're disengaged or is it because they're listening respectfully? That's the kind of evaluation that you'll make. If it's an in-group member, you're more likely to say they're respectfully listening. If it's an out-group member, you're more likely to think it's a negative behaviour, etc. And as a result, you will treat members of your in-group with better and prefer them in decision-makings. So you do that at the expense of objectivity in your decision-making. There are many bases on which you can categorise an in-group. They can be things like nationality or race, but often these demographic differences are overcome when you know someone. And so it becomes more about what part of the organisation. Are you part of my work group team or not? What's your professional background? Even if you're in a group assignment, there's going to be an in-group, people in your group, and then an out-group. Okay? So these in-groups are constantly changing and evolving, but you can see the effects in organisation when we generally work in teams, in companies, etc., that we're naturally creating these in-groups and out-groups. How might that play out? Well, if you're in a larger corporation with several regional teams and a headquarters region, and you're at headquarters and you've got to select which region will receive a boost, an investment, it's very easy for the people making that decision to subconsciously trust the competence and ethics of the people from their own region because they know them, right? Well, look, provided they're not idiots or dills, right? So provided you trust those people, you're probably going to trust them more than the people from the other groups. That's an example of in-group bias. And in organisations, that can distort where you put resources, can undermine fairness and even the ethical integrity stand that companies take. A third kind of bias is outcome bias. Outcome bias is simply the problem of judging an action or decision more heavily based on the outcome than whether it was a good decision. Just because you make a good decision doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a good outcome, and vice versa. An outcome bias is the recognition that when we when we look back at what happened, we overweight the outcome versus whether it was a good decision. So the classic to understand this comes from the study of Barron and Hershey, which showed that the quality of medical decisions was judged based upon whether the patient improved or worsened rather than whether the treatment was more correct. And so there could have been a lot of things that affect whether the patient improves or worsens, and in fact sometimes placebo. So what they're saying here is we overweight the outcome rather than the process of decision making. So if you had an investment manager who takes a high-risk strategy without doing due diligence and ignores red flags, but it becomes profitable, the managers and colleagues probably see the decision as brilliant. They don't actually question the process of decision-making. Over time, this bias can very well encourage decision-makers to ignore ethics, to adopt shortcuts, particularly if it's going to result in success. This, of course, is one of the common criticisms of modern business, that they're all after profit and the outcome. So this is a particularly pernicious bias that we want to be aware of in business. The final bias that we want to deal with is a generalised one of moral disengagement. So this is the situation where individuals convince themselves that standards do not apply to them in a particular context. This is particularly important in business because that context may be that when I'm at business or when I'm in my job, I don't need to think about this ethical problem. That allows you to sidestep the feelings of guilt, etc., associated with doing something that you don't agree with to justify your unethical actions. For instance, if you had a manager who instructs you to falsify performance metrics, right? You might say, you as the employee might say, well, I've got to do what my manager says. The manager might morally disengage by saying that, look, all the departments are inflating their numbers. I'm just keeping it real. Or if you were doing a subject and you thought all your colleagues were inappropriately using AI, you might say, well, everyone's using AI, so therefore I should too. That's an example of moral disengagement. People detaching from their moral standards to ease their guilt and discomfort while they're engaging in what they know are unethical practices. Okay, so there you have it, the end of the content for this first module. You'll remember that what we covered was a definition of what ethics is, the relationship between the self, others, and what is right. Throughout this particular series of videos, we've been trying to differentiate ethics from other standards, particularly social norms, business best practice, professional codes, religion, right? It's a different kind of decision making. Once we recognise this, we run across the problem of ethical relativism. Is ethics absolute or does it vary by culture? And that's a personal issue that we have to wrestle with and come to a conclusion on. We do note that there are some problems if we take an ethical relativism perspective. The problems that we can't judge others' behaviour or other societies ethically because it may be ethical for them under relativism, and that we can't progress. Once we wrestle with that problem, we also start to recognise that even if we're a moral absolutist, there's no one framework that helps us objectively determine what's right, and that to some degree our ethical perspective is a preference rather than a judgment. Finally, because it's a preference and not easily provable, we have to be even more conscious about biases that can affect our decision making. You'll remember in the second lecture we talked about the fact that there are these other external factors that can affect our ethical decision making, and one of the key ones in organisation is biases. This week we looked at some of the individual level biases in this particular video, things about our decision making within organisations that can make us stray from what we think is ethically correct. In the next module, we'll move on to discussing some of the key frameworks around ethics. How do we justify a decision as being ethical from some of the classical models used throughout the world for, in some cases, thousands of years? And we'll also discuss some group-level biases that, again, may make us stray from what we believe is the ethically correct decision. We'll see you then.